The chess piece trembled between Daniel Torres's weathered fingers, a black knight suspended in the air above the worn board at the Brookstone Community Center. Before we dive into this incredible chess match that changed 4 lives forever, this story will take just 4 minutes of your time, but could inspire you for decades. If you enjoy stories about second chances, unexpected love, and the power of brilliant children to see what adults miss, please hit that like button and subscribe for more heartwarming tales that prove love finds a way. Across from him, 11-year-old Zoe Sterling sat with the poise of someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve. Her emerald eyes calculated moves 5 turns ahead, while her perfectly manicured nails, unusual for someone her age, drummed against the mahogany table with the rhythm of a metronome. The late afternoon sun streamed through the community center's tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the scuffed linoleum floor, where folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows for the weekly Riverside Heights Chess Club meeting. "You're overthinking again, Mr. Torres," Zoe said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone raised in boardrooms and private schools. "Chess isn't about second-guessing yourself. It's about seeing the patterns that others miss, understanding that every move creates ripples across the entire board." Daniel set the knight down with a soft click, completing a move that he suspected was exactly what she wanted him to play. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar harsh glow across the community center that had become his sanctuary these past 6 months. The smell of burnt coffee from the ancient machine in the corner mixed with the industrial cleaning solution the janitor used every evening, creating an oddly comforting aroma that reminded him this was a place where ordinary people gathered to do extraordinary things with their minds. "Easy for you to say," Daniel replied, studying the board with the same focused intensity he once brought to architectural blueprints. "Some of us didn't grow up with grandmasters for private tutors." Zoe's laugh was musical, sophisticated beyond her years, but underneath it, Daniel caught something else, a loneliness that reminded him of his own daughter Maya's voice when she talked about feeling different from the other kids at Westfield Elementary. "Tutors don't teach you everything, Mr. Torres. They can't teach you why someone makes the moves they do. They can't teach you to read the story behind each game." The Brookstone Community Center had definitely seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips, revealing decades of different color schemes underneath, like archaeological layers telling the building's history. The basketball hoops at the far end of the gymnasium had nets that hung in tatters, and the small stage where local theater groups once performed now served as storage for stacked chairs and forgotten Christmas decorations from years past. But for 2 hours every Thursday evening, this forgotten corner of Riverside Heights transformed into something magical. A place where a construction foreman could sit across from a tech CEO's daughter and pretend that the outside world, with all its complications, hierarchies, and unspoken rules, simply didn't exist. 6 months ago, Daniel had been walking past the community center after another grueling day at the Meridian construction site, still stinging from his supervisor's public criticism over a delay that wasn't even his fault. The humiliation had settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Through the smudged windows he had seen the chessboards, the quiet concentration of the players, and something about the scene had called to him with an almost magnetic pull. He hadn't played chess since college, hadn't thought about strategy and patience, and the slow, methodical process of building toward victory in years. But that night, watching strangers move pieces across worn boards under flickering fluorescent lights, he remembered what it felt like to use his mind instead of just his hands, to solve problems that required thinking rather than muscle. The chess club was an eclectic mix of characters who had somehow washed up on the shores of this forgotten place. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired high school principal, who played with the fierce determination of someone who had spent 40 years trying to get teenagers to care about education. Her weathered hands moved pieces with surgical precision, and she had a habit of humming old Spanish songs under her breath when she was winning. Then there was Kevin Park, a college student who worked nights at a 24-hour diner and used chess as an escape from textbooks and difficult customers. His playing style was aggressive, impatient, full of sacrificial attacks that either won spectacularly or failed catastrophically, with no middle ground. But Zoe Sterling was different from all of them. She arrived each week in a different luxury vehicle, sometimes a sleek Tesla Model S, other times a pristine Mercedes G-Wagon, driven by various assistants, nannies, or family friends. She would emerge from these vehicles like a small CEO, her private school uniform perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive. The other players treated her with a mixture of respect and bewilderment, unsure how to interact with someone who carried herself like she owned the world but was still young enough to need a permission slip for field trips. She spoke to adults as equals, discussed chess theory with the casual confidence of someone who had been surrounded by excellence her entire life, yet there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood loneliness better than most adults ever would. "Your move, Mr. Torres," Zoe said, pulling him back to the present moment. Daniel looked down at the board and felt his heart sink. In the time he had spent lost in thought, Zoe had quietly dismantled his defenses. Her bishops controlled the long diagonals like snipers on rooftops. Her rooks had doubled on the open file, creating pressure that would only increase with each move. Her queen lurked behind the pawn structure like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was perhaps 4 moves away from checkmate, and they both knew it. The position was hopeless, but something in Zoe's expression suggested that tonight's game was about more than just chess. There was an expectation in her emerald eyes, a sense that this particular Thursday evening at the Brookstone Community Center was going to be different from all the others. Daniel reached for his king, preparing to tip it over in the traditional gesture of resignation, when Zoe's voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Torres," she said, her young voice carrying a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone who hadn't even reached middle school. "Before you resign, can I ask you something important? Something that might change everything." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel Torres had never imagined that his life would be measured in the space between paycheck and paycheck, between school pickup and bedtime stories, between the dreams he once held and the reality he now navigated with careful precision. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had learned that complaining changed nothing, but persistence could move mountains one stone at a time. The alarm clock in his modest 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Heights went off every morning at 5:30 a.m., not because the construction site required such an early start, but because those stolen hours before Maya woke up had become sacred. In the kitchen, with instant coffee steaming in his favorite mug, a Father's Day gift from Maya that read, "World's okayest dad" in cheerful yellow letters, Daniel would spread architectural sketches across the small table where they ate most of their meals. These weren't blueprints for Meridian construction. These were his own designs, drawn by lamplight after Maya had gone to sleep, dreams rendered in pencil and hope. A sustainable housing project for young families. A community center that could serve multiple neighborhoods. A small apartment complex designed with single parents in mind. Laundry facilities on every floor, built-in childcare spaces, affordable rent that didn't force people to choose between decent housing and decent food. Daniel had been 2 semesters away from his architecture degree when everything changed. Sarah's pregnancy had been a surprise, beautiful, terrifying, life-altering. They were young, barely 23, but deeply in love, and convinced that love could overcome any practical obstacle. When Sarah died in a car accident just 3 months after Maya was born, Daniel's world didn't just change. It shattered and reformed into something entirely unrecognizable. The university offered extensions, payment plans, even partial scholarships for his situation. But Maya needed food, shelter, medical care, and someone present enough to notice when she smiled for the first time, took her first steps, spoke her first word. The architecture degree went into the same mental filing cabinet as other luxuries he couldn't afford. Travel, hobbies, dating, the assumption that the future would unfold according to plan. He loved it all. Meridian Construction wasn't just a job. It was a lifeline that paid well enough to keep them afloat while offering the kind of schedule flexibility that allowed him to be at every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every moment when Maya needed her father to simply be present. His supervisor, Frank Morrison, was a decent man who understood that some employees worked for paychecks, while others worked for purposes larger than themselves. But decent didn't mean easy. Construction work was physically demanding, requiring the kind of stamina that became harder to maintain with each passing year. Daniel's hands bore the accumulated evidence of a decade and a half working with concrete, steel, and power tools, calluses that told stories, scars that marked lessons learned, a persistent ache in his lower back that reminded him daily that his body wasn't designed for indefinite manual labor. The other workers respected him, trusted his judgment, often sought his opinion on complex problems that required more than brute force to solve. Daniel had an intuitive understanding of how buildings worked, how weight distributed through frames, how to look at a set of blueprints and envision the finished structure in 3 dimensions. His architectural training, though incomplete, gave him insights that made him valuable in ways that went beyond physical capability. Yet respect didn't translate to advancement. The foreman positions went to men with business degrees and family connections. The project management roles required credentials he didn't possess and couldn't afford to pursue. At 34, Daniel found himself caught in a professional limbo. Too skilled for basic labor, too under-credentialed for leadership roles, too financially responsible for Maya to take the risks that career advancement often required. Maya Torres was 8 years old, and everything good about Daniel's life condensed into 60 pounds of curiosity, creativity, and stubborn determination that she had inherited in equal measure from both parents. She attended Westfield Elementary, where her teachers consistently described her as bright but quiet, someone who observed more than she spoke, who approached new situations with cautious intelligence. The apartment they shared was small, but carefully organized to maximize both function and comfort. Maya's bedroom was painted soft lavender, her choice, with glow-in-the-dark stars arranged on the ceiling and actual constellation patterns that Daniel had researched and installed during a weekend project. Her bookshelf overflowed with library books and garage sale discoveries, evidence of a reading habit that both thrilled and worried him. She read voraciously, but often chose stories about children in different circumstances, boarding schools, big families, adventure-filled lives that bore no resemblance to their quiet existence in Riverside Heights. Evenings followed a comfortable routine. Homework at the kitchen table while Daniel prepared dinner, usually something simple but nutritious. Pasta with vegetables, grilled chicken with rice, occasionally pizza on Fridays when the week had been particularly challenging. Maya would tell him about her day in careful detail, describing her classmates, activities, her teachers, moods, the playground dynamics that seemed to shift daily among second graders. But Daniel noticed what she didn't say as much as what she did. She never mentioned birthday parties she'd been invited to, playdates with school friends, or the kind of social connections that seemed effortless for other children. Maya was well-liked, but not deeply connected. Accepted, but not truly included in the complicated social networks that formed among families with more time, more money, more availability for the kind of relationship building that required margin in life. The chess club had become an unexpected refuge for both of them. While Daniel played, Maya would sit nearby with her homework or a book, occasionally watching the games with the same focused attention she brought to everything else. The other players had adopted her as an unofficial mascot, teaching her basic moves, including her in their discussions about strategy and tactics. "Dad," Maya had said one evening as they walked home from the community center, "why don't you ever play chess at home?" The question had caught him off guard. "We don't have a set, sweetheart." "Mrs. Rodriguez said she has extra sets. She said we could borrow one." Daniel had looked down at his daughter, seeing something in her expression that suggested the question was about more than just chess pieces. "Would you like that? Would you like to learn to play?" Maya's nod was enthusiastic but careful, the response of someone who had learned not to ask for things that might be too expensive or time-consuming. "I think it would be fun. And maybe," she had paused, searching for words, "maybe it would give us something special to do together, something that's just ours." That conversation had led to evening chess lessons at their kitchen table, Maya proving to have a natural aptitude for the game that both surprised and delighted Daniel. She approached chess with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else, asking thoughtful questions about strategy, remembering patterns with remarkable clarity. But it was during these chess lessons that Daniel began to notice how Maya studied him, as much as she studied the board. Her questions often revealed insights about his own playing style, his decision-making patterns, his tendency to prioritize safety over ambition in ways that extended far beyond chess. "Dad," she had said one evening after capturing his queen in a brilliantly calculated combination, "do you ever wonder what would happen if you took more risks?" "Not scary risks," she had added quickly, "but good risks, the kind that might make things better." The question had lingered long after their game ended, echoing in the quiet hours when Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his architectural sketches, wondering if Maya had somehow intuited the central tension of his adult life, the space between the safety he had chosen and the dreams he had deferred, between the father he needed to be and the man he sometimes still hoped to become. Tonight, sitting across from Zoe Sterling at the Brookstone Community Center, Daniel found himself thinking about Maya's question as the 11-year-old chess prodigy prepared to ask him something that might change everything. The weight of Zoe's expectation felt similar to the weight of his own daughter's faith in his potential, hopeful, challenging, and impossible to ignore. "What did you want to ask me, Zoe?" Daniel said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. Zoe Sterling leaned back in her chair, her emerald eyes studying Daniel with the calculating intensity of someone who had spent years observing adult behavior from the unique vantage point of childhood invisibility. At 11 years old, she possessed the rare combination of genuine innocence and strategic sophistication that only emerged in children who had been forced to navigate complex adult emotions before they were old enough to understand why such navigation was necessary. "Mr. Torres," she began, her voice taking on a tone that was both casual and carefully measured, "how long have you been playing chess?" Daniel blinked, surprised by the apparent simplicity of her question after the dramatic build-up. "About 6 months, I suppose, since I started coming to the club." "And before that, when you were younger?" "College," Daniel admitted, unconsciously straightening in his chair. "I played for the University Chess Club during my sophomore and junior years. Nothing serious, just casual games and the occasional tournament." Zoe nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "You have good instincts, but you play like someone who's afraid of making mistakes. Like you're more concerned with not losing than with actually winning." The observation hit closer to home than Daniel cared to admit. It wasn't just about chess, it was about everything. His job, his parenting, his careful management of their small life in Riverside Heights. When you were responsible for someone else's well-being, when you were the only safety net between your child and disaster, playing it safe became more than a strategy. It became a moral imperative. "Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Daniel asked, moving his knight to a defensive square that he knew would only delay the inevitable. "That depends," Zoe said, capturing a pawn with surgical precision, "on whether you think the life you're currently living is the life you actually want." Around them, the Brookstone Community Center continued its Thursday evening rhythm. Mrs. Rodriguez was explaining a complex endgame position to Kevin Park, her weathered finger-tracing patterns across the worn board with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching reluctant students. The elderly Mr. Patterson sat alone at a corner table, working through chess problems from a dog-eared magazine, occasionally muttering to himself in what sounded like Russian or Polish. The normalcy of the scene made Zoe's philosophical observations feel even more surreal, as if she were conducting some kind of psychological evaluation disguised as casual conversation. "Zoe," Daniel said carefully, "you're 11 years old. What could you possibly know about the life I want versus the life I have?" For the first time since he had known her, Zoe's composure flickered. Something vulnerable passed across her features before being quickly suppressed, like a cloud shadow racing across sunlit ground. "I know what it looks like when adults stop dreaming," she said quietly. "I know what happens when people convince themselves that wanting things is selfish or unrealistic or dangerous. I know because I live with 2 people who have forgotten what it means to hope for something better." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that they were no longer talking about chess at all. "Your parents?" Zoe's laugh was bitter, sophisticated in a way that made Daniel's heart ache. "My mother and stepfather. Though calling Richard my stepfather gives him more credit than he deserves. He married my mom 2 years ago, but he's never really tried to be anything more than a polite stranger who happens to live in our house." She moved her queen to a central square, creating multiple threats that forced Daniel to calculate frantically. But her chess moves seemed almost secondary to the conversation she was really trying to have. "My biological father died when I was 6, Zoe continued, her voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone that children used when discussing tragedies they had been forced to accept. "Car accident on the interstate. One moment he was driving home from work, the next moment he was gone, and everything that made our family feel like a family disappeared with him." Daniel stopped calculating chess variations and gave Zoe his full attention. This was clearly territory she didn't often share, and something about the late afternoon light streaming through the community center windows seemed to have created a confessional atmosphere. "My mom tried to hold everything together by herself for about 2 years, Zoe said, absently adjusting the position of her bishop. "She's incredibly smart. She has a master's degree in business from Northwestern, speaks 3 languages, can make million-dollar decisions without breaking a sweat. But grief isn't something you can manage like a quarterly earnings report. Daniel understood exactly what she meant. The early months after Sarah's death had taught him that loss operated according to rules that had nothing to do with logic, planning, or professional competence. Then she met Richard, Zoe continued. He's successful, stable, financially secure, everything that looks good on paper. They got married in a small ceremony at his country club. Very tasteful, very proper, very empty of anything that resembled actual joy. "And how do you fit into all of this?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I don't," Zoe said simply. "Not really. Richard tries to be nice to me, but he doesn't understand children, especially children who ask uncomfortable questions or notice things that adults prefer to keep hidden. And my mom, she loves me, but she's so focused on making her new marriage work that she doesn't have energy left for anything else." She paused, studying the chessboard with renewed intensity. They live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, attend the same social functions, but they don't actually connect about anything that matters. They've built a life that looks successful from the outside, while being completely hollow on the inside. Daniel felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the recognition of another adult who was struggling with responsibilities that seemed larger than any individual should have to carry. But Zoe wasn't an adult, despite her sophisticated vocabulary and penetrating insights. She was 11 years old and trying to manage emotional complexities that challenged people 3 times her age. "Zoe," he said gently, "that sounds like a really difficult situation, but I'm not sure what any of this has to do with me." Zoe's smile was mysterious, loaded with implications that made Daniel suddenly wary. "It has everything to do with you, Mr. Torres. Because you're exactly the kind of person my mom needs to remember what it feels like to be truly understood by someone." "I don't think I follow." "My mother," Zoe said, moving her rook to create a discovered attack that Daniel hadn't seen coming, "is Elena Sterling. She's the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the Pacific Northwest. She's brilliant, accomplished, and desperately lonely." Daniel's hand froze halfway to his king. Sterling Dynamics was a name he recognized from news articles and business magazines, a company that specialized in sustainable technology solutions for urban development, the kind of innovative work that aligned perfectly with his own architectural dreams about environmentally conscious design. "She's also," Zoe continued with the timing of someone delivering a carefully planned revelation, "recently separated from Richard. They're living in different wings of the house while they figure out how to divorce without creating a scandal that would damage either of their professional reputations." The information hit Daniel like a physical blow, rearranging his understanding of the conversation they were having. This wasn't just an 11-year-old sharing family troubles. This was something much more calculated and potentially dangerous. "Zoe," Daniel said, his voice carrying a warning tone that he usually reserved for Maya when she was contemplating something inadvisable, "what exactly are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you," Zoe said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks, "that I have a proposition for you. A challenge, if you will." Daniel felt the ground shifting underneath him. The comfortable predictability of his Thursday evening chess games suddenly replaced by something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. "I'm listening," he said, though every instinct he possessed was telling him to tip over his king, pack up his chess set, and walk away from whatever Zoe Sterling was about to propose. "Beat me in chess," Zoe said, her green eyes sparkling with anticipation, "and I'll arrange for you to meet my mother." Not as some random introduction, but as someone whose ideas about sustainable architecture and community development she needs to hear. The offer hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in an ancient courtroom. Daniel stared at this 11-year-old who had somehow positioned herself as the architect of his potential future, understanding that she had been maneuvering toward this moment since their first game together. "And if I can't beat you?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Zoe's smile was enigmatic, carrying secrets that seemed far too complex for someone who still needed permission slips for field trips. "Then we keep playing chess every Thursday night, and I keep watching 2 adults who could be perfect for each other waste their lives being politely miserable instead." Daniel stared at Zoe Sterling, feeling as though the familiar geometry of the Brookstone Community Center had suddenly rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. The chessboard between them seemed to pulse with new significance. Each piece transformed from a simple game component into a potential catalyst for life-altering change. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same steady rhythm they always had, but everything else felt fundamentally different. "You want me to beat you at chess," Daniel said slowly, testing the words to see if they made more sense spoken aloud, "so you can introduce me to your mother, who happens to be the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in the region." Essentially, yes. Zoe's response was matter-of-fact, as if she had just suggested they order pizza, rather than proposing a scheme that could reshape multiple lives. Though when you put it like that, it sounds almost too simple. Daniel rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache that had nothing to do with chess tactics, and everything to do with the surreal conversation he was apparently having with someone who should be worried about homework and playground politics, rather than orchestrating adult relationships. "Zoe, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do here, but this is—" He searched for words that could adequately describe the mixture of intrigue and alarm coursing through his system. "This is complicated in ways I don't think you fully understand." "Mr. Torres," Zoe said, her voice taking on a patience that seemed borrowed from someone much older, "I understand more than you think. I understand that my mother works 16-hour days because she's afraid of going home to a house that feels like a museum. I understand that you spend your evenings drawing architectural plans for buildings that will never be constructed because you're convinced that dreaming bigger than your current circumstances is somehow irresponsible." She leaned forward, her green eyes reflecting a combination of determination and vulnerability that made Daniel's chest tighten with recognition. This was the expression Maya wore when she was trying to convince him to take risks that scared both of them, applying for better jobs, signing up for parent activities at school, anything that required stepping outside the carefully controlled boundaries of their life together. "I also understand," Zoe continued, "that both of you are wasting your potential because you've confused being careful with being wise. My mother could revolutionize urban planning if she had a partner who shared her vision for sustainable development. You could design buildings that actually matter if you had access to resources, and someone who believed in your ideas." Daniel felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest, a mixture of hope and terror that he had spent years teaching himself to suppress. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons why Zoe's proposal was impossible. The vast differences in social class, professional status, and life experience that separated him from Elena Sterling. The practical obstacles that would make any meaningful collaboration unlikely, let alone romantic connection. But underneath the rational objections was something else entirely. Curiosity about what it might feel like to have his architectural ideas taken seriously by someone with the power to bring them to life. Wonder about what kind of woman could run a major corporation while raising a daughter as perceptive and strategically minded as Zoe. A tiny, persistent voice that whispered maybe this was exactly the kind of good risk that Maya had been encouraging him to consider. "Even if I wanted to take your challenge seriously," Daniel said, his voice carefully controlled, "there's one rather significant problem. You're one of the strongest chess players I've ever encountered. The idea that I could beat you in a fair game is—" He gestured at the board, where Zoe's pieces controlled key squares with mathematical precision. "It's not realistic." Zoe's smile was enigmatic, carrying implications that made Daniel suddenly wary. Who said anything about a fair game? "I'm sorry." "Mr. Torres, I've been playing chess since I was 4 years old. I've had private lessons with grandmasters, attended summer camps with other prodigies, studied theory at a level that most adult tournament players never reach. If we played 100 games under normal circumstances, you might win 1 or 2 through sheer luck." Daniel felt his confidence deflating like a punctured balloon. "Then why are you offering this challenge?" "Because," Zoe said, moving her queen to a square that created multiple threats Daniel hadn't anticipated, "I'm not talking about beating me today. I'm talking about beating me when you're playing your absolute best chess. When you've studied theory, practiced tactics, analyzed your weaknesses, and worked to improve them." She reached into her expensive messenger bag and pulled out 3 thick chess books, sliding them across the table with the same deliberate precision she brought to every move. "Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, Silman's Complete Endgame Course, Tactics Time, 1001 Chess Tactics from the Games of Everyday Chess Players." Daniel picked up the first book, feeling its substantial weight. The pages were crisp, unmarked, clearly purchased recently and specifically for this moment. "You bought these for me?" "I bought them for us," Zoe corrected, "for this challenge. I want you to study these books, practice the exercises, Learn the patterns that separate strong players from weak ones. I want you to understand chess at a level that will make our eventual game meaningful. How long are we talking about? 6 weeks, Zoe said without hesitation. 6 weeks of serious study, combined with practice games against other players here at the club. Mrs. Rodriguez has agreed to work with you on endgame technique. Kevin can help you develop more aggressive tactics. I'll even provide hints about my own playing style and the openings I prefer. Daniel stared at the books, understanding that Zoe was offering him something far more significant than chess improvement. She was proposing a crash course in believing that he could become better than he currently was, that 6 weeks of dedicated effort could bridge the gap between his present limitations and his unrealized potential. And at the end of 6 weeks? Daniel asked. We play one game, Zoe said simply. Winner takes all. If you beat me, I arrange a meeting between you and my mother. If I win, we forget this conversation ever happened, and things go back to the way they were. The proposition hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that his response would echo through multiple lives in ways he couldn't fully predict. Around them, the chess club continued its Thursday evening routine, unaware that one of their tables had become the site of negotiations that could reshape the future. Zoe, Daniel said carefully, why is this so important to you? Why go to all this trouble for two adults who are essentially strangers? For the first time since she had begun her carefully orchestrated revelation, Zoe's composure cracked slightly. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years observing adult unhappiness without being able to do anything about it. Because I'm tired of watching people waste their lives being afraid, she said quietly. I'm tired of seeing my mother come home from work with that empty look in her eyes, like she's accomplished everything she's supposed to want but somehow missed the part where accomplishment is supposed to make you happy. She paused, absently straightening the chess pieces that had been captured during their game. And I'm tired of watching you draw those beautiful building designs during your lunch breaks, then fold them up and put them away like there's some kind of guilty secret instead of brilliant ideas that could actually help people. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. You've been watching me at work? The construction site for the new Riverside Heights library expansion is visible from the 3rd floor windows of Sterling Dynamics, Zoe explained matter-of-factly. I sometimes eat lunch in my mom's office when I have half-days at school. I've seen you sketching during your breaks, seen the way you study the building plans like you're trying to solve puzzles that no one else even notices. The revelation that he had been unknowingly observed for months should have felt invasive. But instead, Daniel found himself impressed by the thoroughness of Zoe's preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous matchmaking scheme. It was a carefully researched project that had been months in the making. You've been planning this for a while, Daniel said, and it wasn't a question. Since September, Zoe admitted. That's when I started coming to chess club. Not because I needed practice. I'm already rated higher than most of the adults here. I came because I wanted to understand what kind of person you were outside of work, whether you were someone my mother could respect, someone who shared her values about using success to create positive change rather than just accumulating wealth. Daniel felt something that might have been vertigo, the sensation of standing at the edge of a precipice while being asked to trust that the ground on the other side was solid. Everything about Zoe's proposal defied the careful risk management that had governed his decisions for the past 8 years. It required believing that 6 weeks of chess study could somehow bridge the vast gap between his current life and the possibility of connection with someone whose existence had been purely theoretical until this moment. But as he looked at the chess books Zoe had selected, as he considered the careful thought that had gone into every aspect of her plan, Daniel found himself thinking about Maya's question from the previous week. Do you ever wonder what would happen if you took more risks? Not scary risks, but good risks. The kind that might make things better. 6 weeks, Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 6 weeks, Zoe confirmed, her smile radiant with triumph and relief. And Mr. Torres? I want you to know that I wouldn't have offered this challenge if I didn't believe you could rise to meet it. The question isn't whether you're capable of beating me. The question is whether you're brave enough to become the player and the person you're capable of being. The chess books sat on Daniel's kitchen table like 3 silent judges, their pristine covers reflecting the overhead light in ways that seemed almost accusatory. It had been 4 days since Zoe Sterling had made her impossible proposition, and Daniel had yet to open a single page. Instead, he found himself circling the books during his morning coffee routine, studying them with the same wary attention he might give to unexploded ordnance. Maya noticed, of course. At 8 years old, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect changes in the emotional atmosphere of their small apartment, and Daniel's newfound habit of staring intensely at chess books while forgetting to eat his breakfast had not escaped her attention. "Dad," she said over her bowl of cereal, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had been waiting for an adult to explain obvious weirdness, "are you going to read those books, or are you planning to learn chess through osmosis?" Daniel looked up from his untouched coffee, realizing he had been lost in thought for longer than he'd intended. "Sorry, sweetheart, just thinking. About chess. About complicated things." Maya set down her spoon with the deliberate precision that indicated she was shifting into serious conversation mode. "Dad, you know you can tell me stuff, right? I mean, age-appropriate stuff. I'm not asking for details about taxes or whatever, but if something's bothering you, I want to know." The earnestness in her voice made Daniel's chest tight with the familiar mixture of pride and heartbreak that came with raising a child who had learned to be more emotionally mature than circumstances should have required. Maya had been forced to develop sophisticated coping mechanisms for uncertainty because their life together had taught her that adults didn't always have clear answers to important questions. "There's this girl at chess club," Daniel began carefully, then immediately realized how that sounded. "Not a girl like that, a kid. She's 11, about your age, but she's complicated." Complicated how? Daniel considered how to explain Zoe Sterling's strategic sophistication without making her sound manipulative or concerning. "She's very smart, like scary smart. And she's got this idea that might help me with work stuff, but it would require me to get a lot better at chess very quickly." Maya's eyes lit up with interest. "Like tournament better? Or just better than you are now?" "Tournament better, maybe even better than that." "And you're worried you can't do it?" The question hit closer to home than Daniel was comfortable admitting. The truth was that he wasn't just worried about his ability to improve at chess. He was terrified of what it might mean if he actually succeeded. Success would mean meeting Elena Sterling, which would mean stepping into a world where his carefully constructed identity as a competent but unremarkable construction worker would be completely inadequate. "I'm worried about a lot of things," Daniel said honestly. "About whether it's fair to Maya if I spend 6 weeks focused on something that might not lead anywhere. About whether I'm setting myself up for disappointment. About whether some opportunities are too good to be real." Maya considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing constitutional law. "Mom used to say that the biggest risk was not taking any risks at all," she said finally. She said people who were afraid of failing usually ended up failing anyway, just more slowly and with less interesting stories to tell. Daniel felt the familiar stab of grief mixed with gratitude that came whenever Maya shared Sarah's wisdom. His wife had possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that had made her an exceptional social worker and an even more exceptional partner. The fact that some of that insight had transferred to Maya felt like a gift and a responsibility in equal measure. "Your mom was pretty smart," Daniel said, reaching across the table to squeeze Maya's hand. "She was also pretty brave. And she thought you were brave too, even when you didn't feel like it." After Maya left for school, Daniel found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection with the same analytical attention he brought to construction blueprints. At 34, he looked older than his chronological age, the result of years of physical labor, financial stress, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came with single parenthood. His hands bore the accumulated evidence of his profession: calluses from handling tools, small scars from minor accidents, the permanent staining around his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could completely eliminate. Would Elena Sterling see someone worth taking seriously? Or would she see exactly what he was, a construction worker with unfinished education and unrealistic dreams? The question felt both unfair and unavoidable, a reminder of all the ways that class differences created barriers that personal qualities couldn't necessarily overcome. At the Meridian construction site, Daniel's distraction became impossible to hide. He found himself making small errors that he normally wouldn't. Misreading measurements, forgetting to double-check calculations, losing track of conversations halfway through. Frank Morrison noticed by Tuesday afternoon, pulling Daniel aside during the lunch break, with the concerned expression of someone who had managed construction crews long enough to recognize when a reliable worker was operating below standard. "Everything okay at home, Torres?" Frank asked, settling onto the makeshift bench where the crew ate their lunches. "You seem like your mind's somewhere else these days." Daniel considered how much to reveal. Frank was a good supervisor and a decent man, but he was also someone whose entire professional identity was built around practical problem-solving and measurable results. The idea that Daniel was contemplating 6 weeks of intensive chess study in order to meet a tech CEO would probably sound like either a midlife crisis or an elaborate delusion. "Just got some studying to do," Daniel said carefully, "trying to learn some new skills that might help with future opportunities." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of skills? You thinking about going back to school, finishing that architecture degree?" The question triggered a complicated mixture of emotions that Daniel hadn't fully sorted through. Returning to school had been a fantasy he'd entertained during quiet moments, but the practical obstacles, tuition, lost income, childcare complications, had always made it seem impossible. Yet Zoe's challenge represented a different kind of education, one that might open doors that traditional credentialing couldn't. "Maybe something like that," Daniel said, still figuring out the details. Frank nodded, but his expression suggested he was filing the conversation away for future reference. "Well, whatever you're planning, just make sure it doesn't interfere with the job. We've got that inspection coming up next month, and I need everyone focused." That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the first chess book open in front of him, reading the same paragraph about pawn structures for the 4th time without absorbing any of the information. His mind kept wandering to Elena Sterling, constructing elaborate scenarios of their potential meeting based on nothing more than Zoe's descriptions and his own imagination. What did loneliness look like when you had the resources to buy anything you wanted? What kind of conversations would someone with an MBA from Northwestern want to have about sustainable architecture? How would she respond to meeting someone whose most recent professional achievement was supervising the concrete pour for a library expansion? The self-doubt felt familiar, reminiscent of the imposter syndrome he had experienced during his college years when surrounded by classmates whose families had prepared them for academic success in ways his hadn't. The difference was that this time, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about passing a class or fitting in with a peer group. This was about the possibility of fundamental change in the direction of his life. Maya found him there at 9 o'clock, still staring at the same page of chess theory while his dinner grew cold on the counter. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair across from him with the matter-of-fact directness that was her signature approach to problem-solving. "You're doing that thing where you think so hard about whether you should do something that you forget to actually do it." "I'm reading," Daniel protested weakly. "You're staring. There's a difference." Maya reached across the table and flipped to the front of the book, where the table of contents outlined chapters on opening principles, tactical patterns, and endgame theory. "This looks hard but not impossible, like learning to ride a bike, except with more thinking and less crashing." Daniel laughed despite himself, recognizing the echo of his own explanations when Maya had been struggling with new concepts at school. "It's not just about learning chess, sweetheart. It's about bigger things, adult things that are complicated in ways that are hard to explain." "Try me," Maya said, fixing him with the same intense attention she brought to particularly challenging homework problems. Daniel considered how to explain the full scope of what Zoe was offering without overwhelming his 8-year-old daughter with details about romantic matchmaking and professional networking. "The girl at Chess Club, Zoe, her mom runs a company that designs buildings like the ones I sometimes draw. If I get good enough at chess to beat Zoe, she'll introduce me to her mom and maybe I could show her some of my ideas." "That sounds awesome," Maya said immediately. "Why are you acting like it's scary?" "Because what if I study really hard and still can't beat her? What if I meet her mom and she thinks my ideas are stupid? What if I get my hopes up for something that's never going to happen?" Maya considered this with the seriousness of someone who had learned that adult fears were usually more complicated than they initially appeared. "Dad, what if you don't try, and then you spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had been brave enough to find out?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in its clarity. Daniel looked at his daughter, seeing Sarah's wisdom reflected in features that were becoming more recognizably his own with each passing year, and felt something shift in his chest. "You think I should do it?" he asked. I think, Maya said carefully, that the worst thing that could happen is that you fail at something awesome. And the best thing that could happen is that you succeed at something awesome. Either way, it's still awesome that you tried. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, Daniel opened Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess to the first chapter and began to read with the focused attention of someone who had finally decided that some risks were worth taking, even when, especially when, the outcome was uncertain. 2 weeks into his chess study regimen, Daniel had developed a routine that bordered on obsessive. He woke at 5 a.m. to work through tactical puzzles before Maya stirred, spent his lunch breaks at the construction site, analyzing annotated games on his phone, and devoted his evenings to endgame theory with the same methodical attention he once brought to architectural calculations. The transformation was remarkable, not just in his chess understanding, but in the way his mind had awakened to patterns and possibilities he hadn't considered in years. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an unexpected ally in his improvement project, staying after the regular Thursday meetings to work through complex positions that required patience and precision. Her weathered hands would guide pieces across the board while she explained concepts in the patient, thorough manner of someone who had spent 4 decades helping reluctant students grasp difficult material. "Chess is like life, Daniel," she said during one of their extended sessions, demonstrating a queen and pawn endgame that seemed impossibly complex. "The pieces you sacrifice early determine the opportunities available to you later. But most people are so afraid of losing something they can see that they miss chances to gain something they can't yet imagine." Daniel was setting up the position for another practice attempt when Zoe appeared beside their table with the silent approach that seemed to be her trademark. He had been so focused on the lesson that he hadn't noticed the regular chess club members departing, leaving the community center nearly empty except for the custodian preparing for his evening routine. "How's the studying going, Mr. Torres?" Zoe asked, settling into a chair with the casual grace of someone arriving exactly when intended. "Better than I expected," Daniel admitted, gesturing toward the chess book where he had been tracking his progress through tactical exercises. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been incredibly helpful, and I'm starting to see patterns that were invisible to me a few weeks ago." Zoe nodded approvingly, but her expression carried a weight that suggested this visit was about more than checking on his chess improvement. "I'm glad to hear that. Actually, I was hoping we could talk about some things I probably should have mentioned earlier. Background information that might help you understand what you're preparing for." Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her chess set with the practiced efficiency of someone who recognized when younger people needed privacy for important conversations. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, pausing to squeeze Daniel's shoulder with maternal warmth. "Remember what I said about sacrificing pieces, Mijo. Sometimes what looks like a loss is actually the beginning of victory." After she left, the community center felt cavernous, filled with the particular silence that came when spaces designed for crowds were occupied by only 2 people. Zoe pulled out her phone and showed Daniel a photograph that made his breath catch. A professional headshot of a woman with intelligent brown eyes, dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and the kind of confident smile that suggested both warmth and formidable competence. "That's my mother," Zoe said simply, "Elena Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics." Daniel studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the polished professional image with the lonely figure Zoe had described. Elena Sterling looked exactly like what he would expect from a tech executive: polished, authoritative, someone who belonged in boardrooms and industry conferences. The disconnect between her obvious success and Zoe's descriptions of her emotional isolation suddenly felt more real and more heartbreaking. "She's beautiful," Daniel said, immediately feeling foolish for the inadequacy of the observation. "She's also brilliant, accomplished, and completely convinced that her value as a person is tied to her professional achievements," Zoe said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Which is why what I'm about to tell you might sound harsh, but it's important that you understand the full situation." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. What situation? Zoe was quiet for a long moment, her 11-year-old face carrying an expression of gravity that seemed borrowed from someone much older. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, as if each word had been selected with precision. "My mother didn't just marry Richard because she was lonely, or because he seemed like a stable choice. She married him because she was pregnant." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, rearranging his understanding of Elena Sterling's circumstances with brutal efficiency. "Pregnant with?" "With a baby who died," Zoe said quietly. A miscarriage at 12 weeks, about 6 months after the wedding. Mom never talks about it, but I know because I heard her crying in her office one night when she thought everyone was asleep. Daniel felt his chest tighten with recognition and sympathy. The particular kind of grief that came with pregnancy loss was something he had witnessed secondhand when Sarah had experienced 2 miscarriages before Maya was born. The weight of hope transformed into devastating disappointment, the way such losses could create fractures in relationships that were already struggling with other pressures. That's why she and Richard are getting divorced, Zoe continued. Not because they fell out of love. They were never really in love to begin with. They're divorcing because they realized they built their marriage around something that no longer exists, and neither of them knows how to reconstruct a relationship based on who they actually are, rather than who they thought they needed to be. The revelation added layers of complexity to Elena Sterling's situation that made Daniel's own circumstances feel almost simple by comparison. Single parenthood after the death of a spouse was devastating, but it was also clean in its tragedy. Elena was navigating the messier waters of divorce, professional pressure, and the particular kind of loss that left no obvious path forward. "Zoe," Daniel said carefully, "this changes things. Your mother is going through something incredibly difficult right now. The last thing she needs is some stranger appearing in her life with romantic expectations or ulterior motives." "Which is exactly why you're perfect for this," Zoe said, her green eyes sparkling with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully constructed argument was unfolding according to plan. "You're not some predatory opportunist looking to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. You're someone who understands loss, who knows how to rebuild after everything falls apart, who could offer genuine partnership rather than just emotional or financial convenience." Daniel stared at this 11-year-old who seemed to understand adult psychology with frightening clarity. "How do you know all this about me?" "Because I've been watching you for months, remember? I've seen how you interact with your daughter, how you approach problems at work, how you treat the other people here at Chess Club. You're kind without being weak, ambitious without being selfish, and you understand that taking care of people you love sometimes means making sacrifices that other people don't see or appreciate." Zoe pulled out another photograph, this one showing Elena Sterling in a more casual setting, sitting in what appeared to be a home office, surrounded by architectural plans and sustainable development proposals, her professional polish replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the work in front of her. This was taken last month during a planning meeting for the Riverside Heights Community Development Project, Zoe explained. Sterling Dynamics is partnering with the city to create affordable housing that integrates sustainable technology with thoughtful design. It's exactly the kind of work you've been dreaming about. The intersection of environmental responsibility and architectural innovation. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as he studied the photograph. The plans spread across Elena's desk looked remarkably similar to projects he had been sketching during his lunch breaks. Mixed-use developments that prioritized community spaces, energy-efficient design that didn't sacrifice aesthetic appeal, housing solutions that addressed real human needs rather than just maximizing profit margins. "The project needs someone with hands-on construction experience," Zoe continued. "Someone who understands both the practical challenges of building and the vision necessary to create something genuinely innovative. Mom has been struggling to find architects who can bridge that gap between theoretical design and real-world implementation. And you think I could be that person? I think you already are that person. You just need someone to give you the opportunity to prove it." The weight of Zoe's revelation settled over Daniel like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about chess improvement or even about meeting an interesting woman. This was about the possibility of professional transformation, of moving from someone who built other people's designs to someone who created solutions for problems that mattered. But it was also about Elena Sterling's vulnerability, about the ethical implications of approaching someone who was navigating divorce and loss with anything that might be interpreted as romantic interest. The last thing Daniel wanted was to be another complication in an already difficult situation. "Zoe," he said slowly, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Does your mother know about any of this? Does she know you've been planning to introduce us?" Zoe's hesitation was brief but telling. "She knows I've been coming to Chess Club. She knows I've met some interesting people here. She doesn't know about the specific challenge or the timeline we've established. So she has no idea that her 11-year-old daughter is trying to orchestrate her love life. She has no idea that her 11-year-old daughter is trying to save her from a future of professional success and personal emptiness." Zoe corrected with the precise diction of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times. Which is different. Daniel felt the familiar weight of adult responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his own hopes and dreams. It was about the potential impact on a child who was clearly struggling with her family's dissolution, and on a woman who was dealing with challenges that extended far beyond anything he had initially understood. "What happens if this doesn't work out the way you're hoping?" Daniel asked. "What happens to you if your parents' divorce proceeds as planned? Or if your mother and I meet and there's no connection? Or if I'm just not the person you think I am?" For the first time since he had known her, Zoe looked genuinely uncertain. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying adult worries for far too long. "Then I'll have tried everything I could think of to help the people I love most find some happiness," she said quietly. "And maybe that will be enough, even if it doesn't work out perfectly." The honesty in her response made Daniel's chest tight with a mixture of admiration and concern. Zoe Sterling was carrying emotional burdens that would challenge adults twice her age, and her chest challenge represented far more than strategic manipulation. It was the desperate attempt of a child to create stability in a world that had proven itself fundamentally unpredictable. The decision crystallized for Daniel at 3:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, when he found himself standing in Maya's doorway watching her sleep. His daughter lay curled under her constellation-pattern comforter, her dark hair spilled across the pillow in the same wild angles that had characterized Sarah's morning appearance. In the dim glow of her nightlight, Maya's face carried the peaceful expression of someone who trusted that tomorrow would bring possibilities worth waking up for. This was what he was really fighting for, Daniel realized. Not just the chance to meet Elena Sterling or advance his career, but the opportunity to become the kind of father who demonstrated that dreams were worth pursuing even when the odds seemed impossible. Maya had spent 8 years watching him choose safety over ambition, stability over growth. Maybe it was time to show her what it looked like when someone decided to bet on themselves instead of betting against the future. By Thursday evening, Daniel's commitment to Zoe's challenge had transformed from reluctant acceptance into something approaching obsession. He arrived at the Brookstone Community Center 30 minutes early, carrying a notebook filled with opening variations he had memorized during his lunch breaks and tactical problems he had solved while waiting for Maya to finish her after-school activities. The chess books that had initially seemed so intimidating now felt like familiar companions, their margins filled with his annotations and insights. Mrs. Rodriguez found him setting up multiple boards to practice different endgame positions, his concentration so complete that he didn't notice her approach until she cleared her throat softly. "You're early tonight, Daniel," she observed, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints remembered decades of classroom management. "And you look like someone who's made an important decision." "I have," Daniel replied, not looking up from the king and pawn endgame he was analyzing. "I've decided to take this seriously. Really seriously." "Good. Though I should warn you that serious chess improvement requires more than just individual study. You need to play against stronger opponents, test your ideas under pressure, learn to think clearly when the stakes matter." As if summoned by their conversation, Kevin Park arrived with his usual energy, dropping his backpack beside a nearby table and pulling out a chess set with practiced efficiency. The college student had become an unexpected ally in Daniel's improvement project, offering to play aggressive practice games that forced Daniel to defend accurately while looking for counterattacking opportunities. "Ready for tonight's beating?" Kevin asked with cheerful confidence, beginning to set up pieces with rapid precision. "I've been studying some new attacking systems that should give you plenty of practice dealing with tactical complications." What followed was 2 hours of the most intense chess Daniel had ever experienced. Kevin's aggressive style created exactly the kind of pressure-filled positions that would prepare him for facing Zoe's more sophisticated approach. Game after game, Daniel found himself navigating complex tactical sequences, defending against sacrificial attacks, and slowly learning to trust his pattern recognition, even when his rational mind couldn't calculate every variation. "You're getting stronger," Kevin observed after Daniel had successfully defended a particularly vicious kingside assault. 3 weeks ago, that attack would have crushed you in 15 moves. Tonight, you not only survived but found counterplay that forced me to defend. The improvement was measurable but hard-won. Each evening brought new understanding, but also new awareness of how much more there was to learn. Daniel's notebook filled with tactical motifs, pins, forks, skewers, discovered attacks, that he practiced until they became instinctive. His lunch breaks were spent analyzing master games on his phone, studying how grandmasters converted small advantages into decisive victories. Maya noticed the transformation in ways that extended beyond chess. Daniel carried himself differently, spoke with more confidence about future possibilities, and seemed to approach problems at work with renewed creativity. During their evening homework sessions, he would unconsciously apply chess principles to other challenges, thinking several steps ahead, considering multiple options before committing to solutions, recognizing patterns that connected seemingly unrelated problems. "Dad," Maya said one evening as they worked through her math homework together, "you seem different lately, like happier but also more focused. Is it because of the chess thing?" Daniel considered how to explain the psychological transformation that had accompanied his tactical improvement. "It's not just chess, sweetheart. It's remembering what it feels like to get better at something, to work toward a goal that requires everything you've got. Like when you were studying architecture in college?" The comparison hit deeper than Maya probably realized. Daniel's architecture studies had been interrupted not just by practical circumstances, but by the gradual erosion of confidence that came with financial pressure and family responsibilities. The chess challenge had rekindled something he had thought was permanently extinguished, the willingness to believe that intellectual growth was possible even when material circumstances remained difficult. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "Like that, but different. Better, maybe, because now I know what I'm really working for." At the construction site, Daniel's colleagues began noticing changes that extended beyond his lunch break chess study. His approach to problem-solving had become more systematic, more patient. When equipment malfunctions or design complications arose, Daniel would pause to consider multiple solutions before acting, often finding creative approaches that saved time and materials. Frank Morrison pulled him aside during Friday's lunch break, his expression carrying the mixture of curiosity and concern that marked their previous conversation about Daniel's mysterious studying. "Torres, I don't know what kind of course you're taking, but it's affecting your work," Frank said. "In a good way," he added quickly, seeing Daniel's alarmed expression. "You've been more focused, more creative with solutions. Yesterday's fix for the drainage problem was brilliant, saved us probably 2 days of rework." Daniel felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with chess tactics, and everything to do with the way intensive learning in one area seemed to enhance performance across multiple domains. Just trying to think more strategically about problems instead of just reacting to them. "Well, keep it up. I'm submitting your name for the foreman training program that starts next quarter. Your problem-solving skills and the way the crew respects your judgment make you a natural candidate for advancement." The news hit Daniel like an unexpected tactical blow. Foreman training would mean increased responsibility, better pay, and the kind of career advancement he had assumed was permanently beyond reach. More importantly, it would provide the kind of professional credibility that might make him a more legitimate candidate for the architectural collaboration opportunities that Zoe had described. That evening, Daniel called his sister Carmen for the first time in months. She lived in Portland with her husband and 2 children, maintaining the kind of stable middle-class life that Daniel envied and admired in equal measure. Their conversations typically focused on Maya's achievements and Carmen's updates about family gatherings Daniel couldn't afford to attend. But tonight he felt compelled to share the possibility of change that seemed to be gathering momentum in multiple areas of his life. "Danny," Carmen said after listening to his carefully edited explanation of the chess challenge and potential professional opportunities, "you sound different, more like the person you used to be before." She paused, searching for diplomatic language for the years of grief and financial struggle that had followed Sarah's death. "Before everything fell apart," Daniel supplied. "Before you convinced yourself that wanting things was dangerous," Carmen corrected gently. "I know Sarah's death was devastating, and I know raising Maya alone has required sacrifices that most people couldn't make. But maybe it's time to remember that you're allowed to want things for yourself too." After Maya went to bed, Daniel spread his architectural sketches across the kitchen table alongside his chess notation, studying both with the same focused attention. The sustainable housing designs he had been developing during his lunch breaks looked more sophisticated now, informed by the systematic thinking that chess study had reinforced. He could see connections between tactical principles and design problems. The importance of controlling key squares translated to optimizing traffic flow, The value of piece coordination paralleled the integration of functional and aesthetic elements. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond careful management of current circumstances. He envisioned presenting his ideas to Elena Sterling, not as a construction worker with amateur architectural interests, but as someone who understood both the theoretical principles and practical challenges of sustainable development. He imagined Maya visiting construction sites where he was the lead architect rather than just another crew member, seeing her father as someone who created solutions rather than just implementing other people's designs. The vision felt both thrilling and terrifying, but no longer impossible. 3 weeks of intensive chess study had taught him that dramatic improvement was achievable when someone was willing to commit fully to the process. Pattern recognition, tactical calculation, strategic planning. These skills were transferable, applicable to challenges that extended far beyond 64 squares. Daniel opened his notation notebook to a fresh page and began planning his final 2 weeks of preparation with the same methodical approach he brought to complex construction projects. Advanced tactical exercises every morning, endgame practice with Mrs. Rodriguez twice weekly, aggressive games with Kevin to maintain sharpness under pressure, and careful analysis of Zoe's playing style based on their previous encounters. But underneath the technical preparation was something more fundamental. The growing conviction that some opportunities were worth the risk of failure, that Maya deserved to see her father attempt something extraordinary, even if the outcome remained uncertain. Win or lose against Zoe Sterling, Daniel was already becoming someone different from the man who had been afraid to open chess books just a month earlier. The question was whether that transformation would be enough to bridge the gap between his current limitations and the possibilities that awaited on the other side of 64 squares and one 11-year-old's carefully orchestrated challenge. The Brookstone Community Center felt different on the evening of the challenge, as if the familiar space had been transformed into an arena where years of careful choices would be tested against 6 weeks of desperate preparation. Daniel arrived to find that Zoe had orchestrated the setting with the same precision she brought to everything else. The regular chess club members had been politely redirected to other tables, leaving the central station isolated under the harsh fluorescent lights like a stage waiting for its principal actors. Maya sat in the small gallery of folding chairs that Zoe had arranged for witnesses, her 8-year-old face carrying the mixture of excitement and anxiety that came with watching her father attempt something that mattered more than weekend chess games. Mrs. Rodriguez occupied the chair beside her, having volunteered to serve as an unofficial arbiter for what everyone understood was more than just a casual game between club members. "You ready for this, Mr. Torres?" Zoe asked as Daniel approached the table, her voice carrying the same calm confidence she had displayed during their first encounter 6 weeks earlier. But there was something different in her emerald eyes tonight. A flicker of uncertainty that suggested even master manipulators occasionally doubted their carefully constructed plans. Daniel sat down across from her, feeling the familiar weight of the chess pieces as he began setting up his side of the board. 6 weeks of intensive study had transformed these simple wooden objects into extensions of his strategic thinking, each piece carrying specific values and potential that he could now calculate with mathematical precision. "As ready as I'll ever be," Daniel replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The nervousness he had expected was there, but underneath it was something stronger. The quiet confidence of someone who had done everything possible to prepare for this moment. The opening moves developed according to classical principles, both players establishing central control and developing pieces toward active squares. Daniel had spent hours analyzing Zoe's preferred systems, identifying her tendency toward positional pressure rather than tactical fireworks. She liked to build small advantages slowly, accumulating tiny benefits until her opponents found themselves in positions that looked reasonable but offered no good moves. Tonight, however, Daniel was prepared for her style. His own pieces emerged with purpose and coordination, following opening principles he had internalized through repetitive study. When Zoe attempted to transpose into her favorite queen's gambit structure, Daniel surprised her with a precise pawn break that equalized immediately and created the kind of dynamic position where his improved tactical vision could compete with her superior positional understanding. "Interesting choice," Zoe murmured, studying the position with newfound respect. "You've been working on your opening repertoire." Mrs. Rodriguez suggested that knowing your opponent's preferences was half the battle. Daniel replied, developing his bishop to a square that created subtle pressure against Zoe's kingside. The other half was being prepared to deviate from what she expects. The middle game that emerged was unlike any of their previous encounters. Where Daniel had once struggled to find coherent plans, he now maneuvered his pieces with clear strategic intent. The tactical exercises he had drilled for weeks allowed him to spot tactical motifs that Zoe attempted to set up, while the endgame theory he had studied gave him confidence to trade pieces when the resulting positions favored his side. Kevin Park arrived halfway through the game, settling quietly into the improvised gallery with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of what was unfolding. Other club members began to notice the unusual atmosphere, gathering at respectful distances to observe what was clearly more than just another Thursday evening game. "Your father's playing brilliantly," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to Maya, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she watched Daniel navigate a complex tactical sequence that would have overwhelmed him just weeks earlier. "Look how he's thinking. Not just about this move or the next one, but about the position he wants to create several moves from now." Maya nodded solemnly, her attention focused entirely on the board where her father was demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking she had encouraged him to apply to life beyond chess. This wasn't just about winning a game, it was about proving that transformation was possible when someone was willing to commit fully to becoming better than they had been. The critical moment arrived on move 27, when Zoe sacrificed a knight for 2 pawns and dangerous attacking chances against Daniel's king. 6 weeks earlier, such a sacrifice would have triggered panic and defensive errors that would have quickly led to defeat. Tonight, Daniel paused for nearly 10 minutes, an eternity in chess time, to calculate the precise sequence of defensive moves that would neutralize her attack while maintaining material equality. "Take your time," Zoe said quietly, though her voice carried a note of respect that hadn't been present in their earlier games. This is the kind of position that separates good players from strong ones. Daniel found the defensive resource, a quiet king move that removed his monarch from immediate danger while preparing counterplay against Zoe's somewhat exposed pieces. The calculation had required seeing 7 moves ahead with multiple variations, the kind of tactical vision that would have been impossible before his intensive training regimen. Zoe studied the position for several minutes after Daniel's defensive move, her expression cycling through surprise, calculation, and finally something that might have been admiration. "That's a very strong defense," she admitted. "I didn't expect you to find that king maneuver." 6 weeks ago, I wouldn't have," Daniel replied honestly. "But Mrs. Rodriguez taught me that the best defensive moves often look counterintuitive at first glance." The endgame that emerged after the tactical complexities resolved was exactly the kind of position Daniel had spent countless hours studying, a rook and pawn ending where precise technique would determine the outcome. Zoe's slight material advantage was offset by Daniel's more active piece placement, creating the kind of dynamic balance where either player could prevail with accurate play. "This is fascinating," Kevin whispered to the growing audience of club members. "She's technically ahead on points, but his pieces are so much more active that I'm not sure the material matters." What followed was 50 moves of the most precise chess Daniel had ever played. Every decision required careful calculation. Every pawn move carried long-term consequences. Every rook maneuver needed to serve multiple strategic purposes. The position demanded the kind of patience and accuracy that separated amateur enthusiasts from serious players. Zoe fought with the tenacious precision that had made her such a formidable opponent, finding defensive resources that prolonged the struggle far beyond what the position initially suggested. But Daniel's preparation showed in moments where he knew theoretical drawing lines and breakthrough patterns that allowed him to maintain pressure even when the position seemed to be simplifying toward a draw. The decisive breakthrough came on move 78, when Daniel's patient maneuvering finally created a passed pawn that Zoe's rook couldn't simultaneously blockade and defend her own vulnerable pawns. The technical execution required another 12 moves of precise calculation, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. "That's mate in 6, Zoe said quietly, tipping over her king in the traditional gesture of resignation. "Very well played, Mr. Torres. Very well played indeed." "Huh." The applause from the gathered chess club members felt surreal, as if Daniel were hearing it from a great distance. 6 weeks of preparation had culminated in this moment. Not just victory in a chess game, but proof that dramatic self-improvement was possible when someone was willing to commit everything to the process of transformation. Maya was the first to reach the table, her face radiant with pride and excitement. "Dad, that was amazing! You played like those grandmasters in the videos we watch." He played better than that. Mrs. Rodriguez corrected gently, her weathered face creased with satisfaction. He played like someone who refused to accept limitations that other people might have thought were permanent. Zoe remained seated across from Daniel, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for her 11-year-old features to fully contain. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed borrowed from someone much older. "Mr. Torres," she said formally, reaching into her expensive messenger bag to withdraw a cream-colored envelope, "I believe I owe you an introduction." Inside the envelope was a business card for Elena Sterling, along with a handwritten note that made Daniel's pulse quicken. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Sterling Dynamics Conference Room. Come prepared to discuss sustainable architecture and community development. She'll be expecting you." The victory felt both complete and just beginning, as if the chess game had been merely preparation for challenges that would test everything he had learned about strategic thinking, calculated risk-taking, and the courage required to pursue opportunities that seemed impossibly beyond reach just 6 weeks earlier. The Sterling Dynamics building rose 32 stories into the Seattle sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the afternoon clouds with the kind of architectural confidence that spoke of serious money and serious ambition. Daniel stood on the sidewalk across the street, studying the structure with the trained eye of someone who understood how buildings were conceived, designed, and brought to life. The sustainable technology integrated into the facade, solar panels disguised as decorative elements, rainwater collection systems, green walls that served both aesthetic and environmental functions, represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking he had been dreaming about for years. His reflection in the building's polished lobby windows showed a man who looked different from the construction worker who had nervously accepted Zoe's challenge 6 weeks earlier. The chess study had changed more than his tactical vision. It had transformed his posture, his expression, his entire way of carrying himself through the world. He wore his best dress shirt and the one tie he owned, purchased years earlier for Sarah's funeral and rarely used since. Maya had helped him select the combination that morning, declaring with 8-year-old authority that he looked, quote, like someone important. The elevator to the 28th floor was filled with the kind of people Daniel had imagined but never actually encountered. Women in expensive suits carrying tablets, men discussing market projections and quarterly earnings with casual expertise. He felt simultaneously out of place and exactly where he belonged, the paradox of someone whose professional dreams had finally aligned with practical opportunity. Elena Sterling's assistant, a polished young man named Marcus, who spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone managing multiple high-level schedules, led Daniel through a maze of open workspace and private offices to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Puget Sound. The space was designed with the same sustainable principles Daniel had noticed in the building's exterior: reclaimed wood conference table, energy-efficient lighting, living walls that cleaned the air while creating visual interest. "Miss Sterling will be with you in just a moment," Marcus said, gesturing toward the architectural plans and development proposals spread across the conference table. "She asked me to let you know that you should feel free to examine the materials while you wait." Daniel approached the table with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. The plans spread before him represented the Riverside Heights Community Development Project Zoe had mentioned. 20 acres of affordable housing integrated with commercial space, community gardens, and sustainable infrastructure. But these weren't the generic, profit-maximizing designs that typically characterized low-income housing developments. These plans showed genuine care for human dignity, environmental responsibility, and the kind of thoughtful design that could transform a neighborhood rather than just filling it with buildings. "Impressive work, isn't it?" Elena Sterling's voice came from behind him, carrying the warm authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. "Though I suspect the person who designed those preliminary concepts might have some interesting insights about their practical implementation." Daniel turned to find himself face to face with the woman whose photograph had occupied his thoughts for weeks, but whose physical presence was somehow both exactly what he had expected and completely surprising. Elena Sterling was smaller than her professional photograph suggested, perhaps 5'6" in low heels, but she carried herself with the kind of confidence that made height irrelevant. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that emphasized intelligent brown eyes and the kind of smile that suggested both warmth and formidable competence. "Miss Sterling," Daniel said, extending his hand with what he hoped was appropriate professional confidence. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I'm Daniel Torres." "Elena, please, and I should thank you for coming on such short notice." Her handshake was firm, direct, the grip of someone who understood that initial impressions mattered in business contexts. Zoe speaks very highly of your chess playing, but she's been remarkably cryptic about your professional background. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, understanding that they were approaching the moment when Zoe's carefully orchestrated introduction would either succeed or collapse under the weight of reality. I work in construction currently, but I have architectural training that I've been developing through independent study and practical application. Show me, Elena said simply, gesturing toward the plans on the conference table. What do you see when you look at these designs? What works? What doesn't? What could be improved? What followed was the most professionally stimulating conversation Daniel had experienced in over a decade. Elena's questions were precise, informed, challenging in ways that forced him to articulate ideas he had only half-formed during his lunch break sketching sessions. But she listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that good ideas could come from unexpected sources, and her follow-up questions demonstrated genuine interest in his perspective rather than polite professional courtesy. The community garden integration is brilliant, Daniel said, pointing to a section of the plan where residential units surrounded shared growing space. But the water management system could be more efficient if you routed the gray water from the residential units through a natural filtration system before it reaches the garden irrigation. Interesting. How would that work practically? Daniel found himself sketching modifications on a notepad, his architectural training combining with construction experience to create solutions that were both innovative and implementable. Elena watched his quick drawings with the intensity of someone evaluating not just ideas but the person generating them. You've thought about this extensively, she observed. These aren't casual suggestions. They're systematic improvements based on deep understanding of both environmental principles and construction realities. I've been working on variations of these concepts for years, Daniel admitted. During lunch breaks, evenings after my daughter goes to bed, whenever I have time to think about what sustainable community development could look like if it prioritized people over profit margins. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying both his sketches and his face with calculating attention. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of curiosity mixed with something that might have been amusement. Daniel, can I ask you something? How exactly did Zoe convince you to come here today? Because I've known my daughter for 11 years, and this meeting has her fingerprints all over it in ways that go far beyond casual chess club introductions. The directness of her question caught Daniel off guard, forcing him to navigate between honesty and the protective instinct that made him want to shield Zoe from potential consequences of her matchmaking scheme. She mentioned that Sterling Dynamics was looking for someone with construction experience to consult on the Riverside Heights project. She thought my background might be relevant. And that's all she mentioned? Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks, understanding that Elena Sterling hadn't become a successful CEO by accepting incomplete explanations or allowing people to evade direct questions. She may have also mentioned that you were someone who would appreciate innovative approaches to sustainable architecture. Elena's laugh was genuine, musical, carrying notes of both affection and exasperation. My daughter is many things. Brilliant, determined, strategically minded, to a degree that sometimes concerns me. She's also 11 years old and convinced that she understands adult relationships better than the adults themselves. The admission hung between them, acknowledgement of the elephant in the room that neither had been willing to address directly. Daniel felt the carefully constructed professional dynamic shifting into something more personal and potentially dangerous. Elena, he said carefully, I want you to know that I'm here because I'm genuinely interested in this project and the possibility of contributing to sustainable development work. Whatever else Zoe might have been hoping would happen, my primary interest is professional. Good, Elena said, but her smile suggested she was working through implications that extended beyond project management. Because I'm genuinely interested in your ideas, and I think Sterling Dynamics could benefit from someone who understands both design theory and practical implementation. But I'm also curious about something else. What's that? How did you get so good at chess in just 6 weeks? Because Zoe is not someone who loses games to amateur players, no matter how much they've studied. The improvement you demonstrated suggests either natural talent that was dormant for years, or a level of dedicated practice that borders on obsessive. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, recognition that Elena Sterling was asking questions that went deeper than professional qualifications or chess improvement. She was trying to understand what kind of person he was, whether he possessed the kind of determination and strategic thinking that would make him a valuable collaborator in contexts that extended beyond architectural consulting. Both, I think, Daniel said honestly. I played seriously in college but stopped when life became more complicated. The past 6 weeks reminded me what it feels like to commit completely to improving at something, to believe that transformation is possible if you're willing to work for it. And what made you willing to work for it? What made Zoe's challenge worth that level of commitment? The question touched on everything Daniel had been avoiding examining too closely: his attraction to Elena based on Zoe's descriptions, his hunger for professional recognition, his desire to demonstrate to Maya that dreams were worth pursuing even when they seemed impossible. Because, quote, Daniel said, meeting Elena's eyes with the kind of directness that chess had taught him was sometimes necessary even when it felt dangerous, I realized I had been living like someone who had already given up on the possibility that things could be better. Zoe offered me a chance to prove to myself, and to my daughter, that I was still capable of becoming more than I currently was. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the same focused attention she had brought to his architectural sketches. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested they had moved well beyond professional consultation into territory that was far more personal and complex. Daniel, she said quietly, I think we need to have a conversation about what my daughter has really been trying to accomplish. Because this meeting isn't just about the Riverside Heights project, and I suspect you know that as well as I do. 6 months after the chess match that changed everything, Daniel stood in the Sterling Dynamics conference room that had become as familiar as his own kitchen, reviewing final blueprints for the Riverside Heights Community Development Project. The plans spread across the mahogany table represented more than just architectural drawings. They were the physical manifestation of what happened when innovative design met practical construction experience, when someone's dormant dreams found the resources and platform they needed to become reality. The transformation in Daniel's professional life had been swift and comprehensive. Elena had offered him a consulting position within 2 weeks of their initial meeting, recognizing that his unique combination of architectural training and hands-on construction experience filled a critical gap in Sterling Dynamics' development team. What began as part-time consulting on the Riverside Heights project had evolved into a full-time position as Director of Sustainable Construction, complete with a salary that allowed him to move Maya to a better school district and begin saving for her college education. But the changes extended far beyond professional advancement. Daniel carried himself differently now, spoke with the confidence of someone whose ideas were taken seriously by people who could implement them. The chess study that had begun as preparation for Zoe's challenge had become a permanent part of his routine, a daily practice that kept his strategic thinking sharp and reminded him that continuous improvement was always possible. The community garden integration is going to be spectacular, quote, Elena said, joining him at the conference table with the kind of casual familiarity that had developed over months of intense collaboration. The natural filtration system you designed will serve as a model for every future project we undertake. Daniel smiled, studying the section of the plans that showed his water management innovation rendered in precise architectural detail. 6 months ago, those ideas had existed only as lunch break sketches in a construction worker's notebook. Now they were being implemented in a $20 million development that would house 300 families while setting new standards for environmental responsibility. It feels surreal sometimes, Daniel admitted, gesturing toward the blueprints that bore his name as lead consultant. 6 months ago, I was pouring concrete foundations. Now I'm designing systems that could influence urban planning across the Pacific Northwest. You were always capable of this level of work, Elena said, settling into the chair beside him with the easy grace of someone who had learned to balance professional authority with personal warmth. Zoe just created the circumstances that forced you to recognize your own potential. The relationship between Daniel and Elena had developed with the same careful precision that characterized everything else about their collaboration. Their initial professional respect had gradually expanded to include personal friendship, shared dinners that extended well beyond project discussions, and the kind of intellectual partnership that made both of them more effective at everything they attempted. Maya had been the catalyst for deeper connection, charming Elena with the same perceptive intelligence that had helped her father navigate the chess challenge. The three of them had begun spending weekends together. Museum visits, hiking trips, dinners where Maya would demonstrate her rapidly improving chess skills, while the adults discussed architecture, sustainable development, and the challenge of balancing professional ambition with family responsibilities. Speaking of Zoe, Daniel said, checking his watch, "Shouldn't she be here by now? She's never late for project review meetings." "She's in the lobby, actually, but she wanted to give us a few minutes alone before joining us." Elena's expression carried a mixture of affection and exasperation that had become familiar whenever discussing her daughter's continued strategic interventions. Apparently, she has something important to share about the project that requires proper dramatic timing. As if summoned by their conversation, Zoe appeared in the conference room doorway with the same confident bearing that had characterized her chess challenge 6 months earlier. But there was something different about her now, a lightness that suggested the weight of managing her family's emotional well-being no longer rested entirely on her 11-year-old shoulders. "Mr. Torres, Mom," Zoe said, settling into her usual chair with practiced ease. "I hope you're both prepared for some significant news about the Riverside Heights project." Daniel and Elena exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that indicated Zoe had been orchestrating something beyond their awareness. In the months since their initial meeting, they had learned to expect such interventions, though Zoe's schemes had become less about romantic manipulation and more about strategic project enhancement. "What kind of news?" Elena asked, though her smile suggested she was more amused than concerned by whatever her daughter had been planning. Zoe reached into her messenger bag, now replaced with a more age-appropriate backpack, though her organizational systems remained impressively sophisticated, and withdrew a folder that she placed on the conference table with ceremonial precision. "The Riverside Heights project has been selected as a finalist for the National Sustainable Development Award," Zoe announced, her green eyes sparkling with satisfaction. "The application I submitted on behalf of Sterling Dynamics will be reviewed by a panel of experts next month, and if we win, the project will receive national recognition and a grant of $500,000 for additional environmental innovations." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 28 floors below and the soft whisper of the building's climate control system. Daniel stared at Zoe, understanding that she had somehow managed to navigate the complex world of professional applications and competitive grants while they had been focused on design and implementation details. "You submitted an application?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the careful control of someone processing information that challenged her understanding of what was possible. "Without consulting us?" "I submitted an application based on the materials you and Mr. Torres have been developing," Zoe corrected with the precision of someone who had carefully considered the ethical implications of her actions. "Every technical detail, every innovation, every sustainability feature came directly from your work. I simply organized the information in a way that met the competition requirements and highlighted the project's significance." Daniel picked up the folder, scanning the application materials that Zoe had somehow compiled and submitted without their knowledge. The documentation was comprehensive, professional, and remarkably sophisticated, demonstrating understanding of sustainable development principles that would challenge most graduate students in urban planning. "Zoe," Daniel said carefully, "this is incredibly impressive work. But entering professional competitions without consulting the people whose work you're representing could have serious consequences if something goes wrong." "Nothing will go wrong," Zoe said with the calm confidence of someone who had researched every possible outcome. "I've been monitoring the application process for months, tracking the review timeline and ensuring that all requirements were met according to the competition guidelines. The worst-case scenario is that we don't win, which leaves us exactly where we would have been if I hadn't applied." Elena was studying the application materials with the focused attention she brought to all significant business documents, her expression cycling through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been pride. "The sustainability metrics you've compiled are remarkably sophisticated," Elena observed. "Some of these calculations required access to proprietary Sterling Dynamics data and construction cost analysis that shouldn't be available to someone without advanced clearance." Zoe's smile was enigmatic, carrying implications that made both adults suddenly wary. "I may have learned a few things about corporate information systems during my visits to the office, and I may have received some assistance from people who believe this project deserves recognition beyond what it would normally receive through standard industry channels." "What kind of assistance?" Daniel asked, though he suspected the answer would be both impressive and concerning. The kind that comes from having very smart friends whose parents work in related industries, Zoe said diplomatically. And from understanding that sometimes the most important innovations happen when young people refuse to accept that certain opportunities are only available to adults with official credentials. The implications of Zoe's revelations settled over the conference room like morning fog, transforming the familiar space into something charged with possibilities that extended far beyond their current project. If the Riverside Heights development won national recognition, it would establish Sterling Dynamics as a leader in sustainable community planning while providing Daniel with the kind of professional credibility that could open doors throughout the industry. But more than professional advancement was at stake. The application process had required Zoe to articulate the vision that she, Daniel, and Elena had been developing together. A vision of architecture as social responsibility, of development as community building, of business success measured not just in profit margins but in positive environmental and human impact. "There's something else," Zoe said, her voice taking on the weight that indicated she was approaching the most significant part of her announcement. "The competition requires finalist presentations to be delivered by the project team responsible for the innovations being recognized, which means that if we advance to the final round, Mr. Torres will need to present his water management system and community integration designs to a panel of experts at the National Urban Planning Conference." Daniel felt something that might have been vertigo, the sensation of standing at the edge of a precipice while being asked to trust that the ground on the other side was solid. 6 months earlier, he had been a construction worker whose biggest professional achievement was supervising concrete pours. Now Zoe was describing a scenario where he would present his architectural innovations to national experts in sustainable development. "The presentation would be in partnership with Sterling Dynamics," Elena said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone working through complex implications. "Which means you would be representing not just your own work but the company's commitment to innovative sustainable development." "The question," Zoe said, fixing Daniel with the same intense attention she had brought to their chess challenge, "is whether you're ready to step fully into the role you've been preparing for, or whether you're still thinking of yourself as someone who stumbled into opportunities, rather than someone who earned them through talent and dedication." The challenge was different from the chess match 6 months earlier, but the underlying question remained the same. Was Daniel willing to believe in his own potential strongly enough to pursue possibilities that seemed impossibly beyond his current circumstances? This time, however, the stakes extended beyond personal transformation to include professional recognition that could influence sustainable development practices across multiple industries. The National Urban Planning Conference in Denver brought together 1,500 of the country's most influential architects, developers, and policymakers in a convention center that buzzed with the energy of people who shaped how millions of Americans lived and worked. Daniel stood backstage at the main auditorium, wearing his first custom-tailored suit and reviewing presentation notes that represented 2 years of the most intense professional development of his life. The Riverside Heights Community Development Project had not only won the National Sustainable Development Award, it had fundamentally changed how the industry approached affordable housing. The water management system Daniel had designed was now being studied by urban planners in 12 major cities, while the community integration model Elena had refined based on his original concepts was being replicated in developments from Portland to Miami. 5 minutes, Mr. Torres, the conference coordinator said, appearing beside him with the kind of efficient energy that marked professional event management. "The audience is particularly excited about your presentation. We've had requests for additional technical sessions based on the preliminary materials you submitted." Daniel nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness that had accompanied every major presentation over the past 18 months. The difference was that now he recognized the feeling as excitement rather than panic. The natural response of someone who had learned to trust his preparation while remaining humble about the magnitude of what he was attempting to accomplish. In the audience, Elena sat with Maya and Zoe in the section reserved for family members and close colleagues. The three of them had become an unlikely but effective support system, traveling together to conferences and project sites, sharing the experience of watching dreams transform into measurable impact on communities and industries. Maya, now 10 years old, had developed an impressive understanding of sustainable architecture principles through years of dinner-table conversations about Daniel's work. She carried a notebook where she sketched her own building designs, incorporating innovations she had observed during site visits to projects that implemented her father's water management systems. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Maya had asked that morning over breakfast, her question carrying the perceptive concern that had characterized her approach to Daniel's career transition from the beginning. "A little," Daniel had admitted, "but nervous in a good way, like when you're about to do something that matters more than anything you've done before." The presentation that followed was Daniel's most comprehensive explanation of how construction experience could inform innovative design, how sustainable development required understanding both environmental principles and practical implementation challenges. He spoke for 40 minutes to an audience that included CEOs of major development companies, urban planning professors from prestigious universities, and policymakers responsible for housing regulations in major metropolitan areas. But the real impact became apparent during the question and answer session that followed. Dr. Sarah Chen from MIT asked about scalability. Could Daniel's water management approach work in developments with different climate conditions and soil compositions? Marcus Rodriguez from the Department of Housing and Urban Development wanted to know about cost implications for public housing projects. Jennifer Walsh from the American Institute of Architects inquired about training programs that could help other construction professionals develop similar design integration skills. Each question revealed that Daniel's work was being viewed not as an interesting anomaly, but as a potential model for addressing some of the most pressing challenges in American urban development. The sustainable principles he had developed through lunch break sketching and evening study were now being seriously considered by people with the authority to influence housing policy for millions of families. "The most interesting aspect of Mr. Torres's approach," said Dr. Michael Thompson from the Urban Land Institute during the panel discussion that concluded the session, "is how it demonstrates that innovation often comes from practitioners who understand both theoretical principles and real-world constraints. We need more professionals who can bridge the gap between academic design and practical implementation." After the presentation, Daniel found himself surrounded by conference attendees who wanted to discuss collaboration opportunities, consulting arrangements, and potential applications of his innovations to projects across the country. Business cards accumulated in his jacket pockets, representatives from development companies in Chicago, sustainability consultants from San Francisco, university researchers studying affordable housing solutions. Elena appeared at his side during a brief lull in conversations, her expression carrying the mixture of pride and amazement that had become familiar whenever Daniel's professional transformation exceeded even their most optimistic projections. "How does it feel to be in demand?" she asked, gesturing toward the cluster of people waiting to continue conversations about his work. "Surreal," Daniel replied honestly. 2 years ago I was worried about whether I could improve enough at chess to impress an 11-year-old. Now I'm being asked to consult on housing policy for major cities." "The chess improvement was just practice," Elena said with the insight that had made their professional partnership so effective. "What you were really learning was how to believe in your own potential for transformation. Everything else followed from that fundamental shift in perspective." The wider impact of Daniel's work became even more apparent over the following months. The American Institute of Architects invited him to develop a certification program for construction professionals interested in sustainable design integration. 3 major universities added his water management innovations to their environmental engineering curricula. The Department of Housing and Urban Development commissioned Sterling Dynamics to create implementation guidelines for public housing projects nationwide. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what industry publications began calling the Torres model, an approach to sustainable development that prioritized community input, environmental responsibility, and construction practicality in equal measure. Young architects began seeking internships with Sterling Dynamics specifically to learn integration techniques that bridged theoretical design and practical implementation. Maya had become something of a celebrity at Westfield Elementary, where her classmates knew her as the girl whose dad designs buildings that help the environment. She handled the attention with the same thoughtful intelligence she had inherited from both parents, using opportunities to speak at school assemblies about sustainable development to encourage other children to pursue interests that combined creativity with problem-solving. "The coolest thing about my dad's work," Maya had explained to her 4th grade class during a presentation about family careers, "is that he figured out how to make buildings that are beautiful and help the planet at the same time. And he learned how to do it by studying chess, which shows that you never know where good ideas are going to come from." Zoe Sterling, now 13 and even more strategically sophisticated than she had been during her initial matchmaking phase, had begun applying her organizational skills to environmental advocacy projects. She had founded the Young Planners Society at her private school, a group that studied urban development challenges and proposed solutions that combined adult expertise with youthful creativity. The thing about Mr. Torres's success, Zoe had explained to a reporter from Architectural Digest who was writing a profile about innovative approaches to sustainable development, is that it shows what happens when someone stops accepting limitations that other people think are permanent. He didn't become a better architect by going back to school or getting more credentials. He became a better architect by deciding to become the kind of person who solves problems that matter. The chess club at the Brookstone Community Center had also been transformed by Daniel's journey. Mrs. Rodriguez had begun incorporating discussions about strategic thinking and pattern recognition into the weekly meetings, helping other members understand how chess principles could be applied to challenges beyond the 64 squares. Kevin Park was now studying architecture at the University of Washington, inspired by Daniel's example of how construction experience could inform innovative design. But the most profound change was in Daniel himself. The man who had once defined success as simply providing stability for his daughter now understood that true security came from continuously developing the ability to create value for others. His morning chess study had evolved into a broader practice of strategic thinking that he applied to every challenge, from complex technical problems to the interpersonal dynamics that made collaborative projects successful. Standing in the Denver Convention Center, surrounded by industry leaders who sought his expertise on problems that would affect thousands of families, Daniel realized that Zoe's chess challenge had accomplished something more significant than professional advancement or romantic connection. It had taught him that transformation was not just possible but essential, that the greatest risk was not attempting something extraordinary and failing, but accepting ordinary limitations and never discovering what might have been possible with greater courage and commitment. The ripple effects of one 11-year-old strategic intervention were now influencing urban planning across the country, proving that sometimes the most important changes begin with individual decisions to believe that better outcomes are achievable through sustained effort and strategic thinking. 3 years after the chess match that changed everything, Daniel Torres stood in the same Brookstone Community Center where his transformation had begun, but now he occupied the space as a guest speaker rather than a regular player seeking improvement. The worn linoleum floors and flickering fluorescent lights remained unchanged, but the evening's audience included urban planning students from the University of Washington, community development professionals, and families from the Riverside Heights neighborhood whose lives had been directly improved by the innovations that started as lunch break sketches. "The most important thing I want you to understand," Daniel said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to speak truth from experience rather than theory, "is that none of this began with grand ambitions or strategic career planning. It began with an 11-year-old girl who believed that adults could become better than they currently were, and a chess challenge that forced me to confront the difference between accepting limitations and transcending them." Maya, now 12 and sitting in the front row with Elena and Zoe, smiled at the familiar story that had become family legend. But for the community members hearing it for the first time, Daniel's journey from construction worker to nationally recognized sustainable development expert represented something more powerful than personal success. It demonstrated that transformation was possible for anyone willing to commit fully to the process of becoming who they were capable of being. "The principles that govern chess improvement," quote, Daniel continued, "are the same principles that govern any meaningful change in life. First, you must be willing to study patterns that others have discovered before you. Second, you must practice applying those patterns until they become instinctive. Third, you must test your understanding against challenges that push you beyond your current comfort zone. And finally, you must remain humble enough to continue learning even after you achieve initial success." Mrs. Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, nodded approvingly from her seat near the back of the room. The chess club had evolved under her guidance into something more than a weekly game session. It had become a laboratory for developing strategic thinking skills that members applied to challenges ranging from small business development to family relationship management. But the deeper lesson, Daniel said, isn't about chess or architecture or any specific skill. It's about recognizing that the most dangerous limitations are the ones we impose on ourselves through fear, through assumptions about what's possible, through the belief that our current circumstances define our permanent potential. In the audience, James Park, Kevin's father and owner of a small construction company, raised his hand with the tentative gesture of someone asking a question that mattered personally. "Mr. Torres, my son Kevin is now in his 3rd year of architecture school, inspired by your example. But I'm 58 years old and wondering if it's too late for someone like me to pursue the kind of changes you're describing." Daniel smiled, recognizing the question that lay beneath the surface inquiry. "James, 3 years ago I was 34 and convinced that my best opportunities were behind me, that I needed to focus exclusively on providing stability rather than pursuing growth. Age isn't the limiting factor. Our willingness to believe that significant change requires decades of preparation is the limiting factor." He gestured toward the chessboards that still occupied the community center's tables every Thursday evening. Chess teaches us that positions can transform completely in just a few moves, when players are willing to sacrifice pieces they thought they couldn't afford to lose. Life works the same way. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs require letting go of identities or securities that feel essential, but are actually keeping us trapped in patterns that no longer serve us. Elena stepped forward to join Daniel at the front of the room, their partnership now so natural that they could seamlessly share speaking responsibilities without advanced coordination. "What Daniel isn't telling you," she said with the warm authority that had made her such an effective CEO, "is that his transformation also transformed Sterling Dynamics, the communities we serve, and the industry standards we all follow. Individual change creates ripple effects that extend far beyond personal circumstances." The Riverside Heights development that grew from Daniel's lunch break sketches now houses 300 families in environmentally sustainable homes that cost less to maintain than traditional construction, Elena continued. But more importantly, it demonstrated that affordable housing doesn't have to mean substandard housing, that environmental responsibility can be economically viable, and that innovation often comes from people who understand both theoretical principles and practical constraints. Zoe Sterling, now 14 and preparing for high school with the same strategic precision she had once applied to chess and matchmaking, stood to address the audience with the confidence of someone who had learned that age was less important than insight when it came to contributing meaningful perspectives. "The thing about Mr. Torres' story that I think gets missed sometimes," Zoe said, her voice carrying the clarity that had always characterized her observations, "is that it's not really about one person becoming successful. It's about what happens when someone decides to stop being afraid of their own potential and starts being afraid of what they might miss if they don't try." She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented different ages, backgrounds, and current circumstances, but shared the common experience of wondering whether significant change was still possible in their lives. "My chess challenge wasn't just about getting Mr. Torres to meet my mom, though that worked out pretty well," Zoe continued, earning laughter from the audience. "It was about proving that 6 weeks of dedicated effort could transform someone's capabilities in ways that seemed impossible at the beginning. Most people underestimate what they can accomplish in months or years because they overestimate how difficult it is to start." Daniel resumed speaking, his voice taking on the weight of someone sharing conclusions drawn from sustained reflection rather than momentary inspiration. "The question I get asked most frequently at conferences is whether my approach can be replicated by other construction professionals or applied to different industries. The answer is yes, but not because there's something magical about water management systems or sustainable architecture." He gestured toward Maya, whose presence in the audience represented the personal foundation that had made his professional transformation both possible and meaningful. "The approach works because it's based on principles that apply to any kind of learning. Identify patterns that successful people have discovered. Practice applying those patterns until they become instinctive. Test your understanding against real challenges, and maintain the humility necessary for continuous improvement. But the most important principle," Daniel said, his voice becoming quieter but more intense, "is learning to see opportunities where other people see only obstacles." 3 years ago, Zoe's chess challenge felt like an impossible request from a child who didn't understand adult limitations. Today, I recognize it as the most important gift anyone has ever given me, the chance to discover that my limitations were largely self-imposed, and that transformation was possible at any stage of life. Elena stepped beside him again, their physical positioning unconsciously demonstrating the partnership that had developed from Zoe's strategic intervention. "We're sharing this story not to celebrate our specific achievements, but to challenge everyone in this room to identify the chess challenge in your own life, the opportunity that seems too risky or too ambitious or too unlikely to succeed, but that represents exactly the kind of growth that could transform not just your circumstances, but your understanding of what's possible." The session concluded with what had become Daniel's signature challenge to audiences, adapted from lessons learned during those intensive weeks of chess preparation. I want you to identify one skill or goal that you've been avoiding because it seems too difficult or too late to pursue. Then I want you to commit to studying that skill with the same intensity I brought to chess tactics: daily practice, systematic learning, willingness to be uncomfortable while you improve. Give yourself 6 weeks, Daniel said, echoing the timeline that had changed his life. Not 6 months or 6 years, but 6 weeks of focused effort directed toward becoming better than you currently are at something that matters to you. Then come back and tell us what you discovered about your own capacity for transformation. As the audience dispersed, many lingering to ask specific questions about sustainable development, chess improvement, or the practical steps involved in major career transitions, Daniel reflected on how thoroughly his understanding of success had evolved. The man who had once measured achievement by his ability to provide basic stability for Maya now understood that the greatest gift he could give his daughter was demonstrating that adults could continue growing, learning, and contributing to positive change throughout their lives. The chess pieces that had trembled in his fingers 3 years earlier now felt like familiar tools for strategic thinking that extended far beyond 64 squares. But the real transformation had been internal, the shift from someone who accepted limitations to someone who questioned them, from someone who managed circumstances to someone who created opportunities, from someone who protected what he had to someone who invested in what he could become. The universal message was simple but profound. Most of the barriers that prevent people from pursuing meaningful change exist in their own minds rather than in external circumstances. The courage to attempt transformation, the discipline to sustain effort even when progress seems slow, and the wisdom to recognize that growth is possible at any stage of life. These qualities could be developed by anyone willing to approach their own potential with the same strategic thinking that characterized excellence in any field. Maya would carry forward the lesson that dreams deserved serious effort, that adults could change dramatically when they committed to improvement, and that individual transformation created ripple effects that benefited entire communities. In 20 years, when she faced her own challenges and opportunities, she would remember her father's journey from construction worker to industry innovator as proof that extraordinary outcomes were possible for ordinary people willing to do extraordinary work on themselves. The chess challenge that began as one child's attempt to create happiness for the adults she loved had become a demonstration that the most important victories were achieved not against opponents, but against the internal limitations that prevented people from discovering who they were truly capable of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.